All right, folks, here we go. This is the last lecture this year. I do want to point out that once this is done, you should probably be working on your own presentation, your Prezi, as well as what you want to say in class. You should also definitely be working on your report. Whatever your religious group is, whether it's Scientology, Shintoism, Wicca, the whole host, you need to be working on that. I do want to say as well that much of this week's lecture is drawn pretty much directly from Edward Curtis's The Columbia Source Book of Muslims in the United States. It's a great book, highly recommended, and I'm going to be using it a lot today. Now, after 9/11, you all know this, talk of Islam and Muslims became as commonplace in America as discussion about the baseball season, at least in some circles. Books by Islamic studies scholar Bernard Lewis appeared on the New York Times bestseller list, and a rash of other volumes followed. Bookstores really couldn't keep the Quran on their shelves, but that then compared with AM shock jocks, who were full of views about Islam. Concerned citizens wrote into their local papers. Presidential candidates and Sunday Christian preachers discussed Islamic theology on talk shows and in the pulpit. On television, Muslims were asked whether they condemned terror. Mosques held information sessions. High schools and colleges invited guest speakers. More people than ever attended interfaith dialogue groups, and many checked to make sure that their Muslim friends were safe. Muslims in the United States became a source of genuine curiosity, deep compassion, as well as increased government surveillance and fear. Some Americans, unfortunately, called their neighbors the enemy. Others countered that Muslims were neighbors, friends, husbands, sisters, co-workers, doctors, artists, and more. Many Americans acknowledged, frankly, their ignorance about the 2 to 8 million Muslims in the United States. They wanted to learn more. Who were these folks? Where did they come from? What do they believe? What are they like? And so that's where today's lecture question comes from. What is Islam in America like? Now, most American Muslims are loyal, law-abiding, and permanent residents of the United States, if not citizens. The overwhelming majority of American Muslims believe that Muslims should be active participants, that they need to be part of political life, public affairs. Most proudly and very publicly proclaim their patriotism, celebrate America. American Muslims have condemned, absolutely and unequivocally, the use of terror to accomplish political ends, and they have participated in social service agencies, interfaith dialogues, and many support worthy non-Muslim political candidates. One might say that American Muslims hold these views in common despite their diversity. Like Americans as a whole, they disagree about a whole host of other social, economic, and cultural issues. They're Democrats, they're Republicans. How Muslims vote depend on who they are, their race, their gender, age, religious views, sexual orientations, national origins, class, and a whole host of other issues. Some are social conservatives, like Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians. Other American Muslims are far more concerned with poverty at home and abroad, a lack of equal opportunity, and the state of public schools. American Muslims are an incredibly diverse group who traced their ethnic and linguistic roots to every inhabited continent and nearly every country on the planet. They're a microcosm of the Islamic world. Now, many scholars do make a historical distinction between indigenous Muslims, who are mostly African Americans, and immigrant Muslims, who are largely South Asians and Middle Easterners. It's estimated that Black American Muslims may constitute the single largest group of Muslims in the U.S., certainly more than 25% total, though probably less than 40%. Perhaps South Asian Muslims are pretty close to that. As many Americans might suspect, there are also a large number of Arab Americans, those with historical ties to Arabic-speaking countries from Morocco to Iraq. They represent a quarter of the total, probably. While African American, South Asian, and Arab Americans are the three dominant ethnic groups, any inclusive story of Islam must also include the voices of whites, Hispanics, Iranians, Persians, Indonesians, Bosnians, Albanians, Afghanis, Somalis, Nigerians, and many, many others. And of course, American Muslims are not only diverse by ethnic and racial background, but also by religious ideology, belief, and practice. In the aftermath of the 2003 war in Iraq, many Americans are becoming familiar with the religious split in Islam between Sunni and Shia, a sectarian division with historical roots in the question over who should lead the community in the absence of the Prophet Muhammad. While that historical divide does exist in the U.S., it is often less significant than whether one is conservative or liberal. Now, I say that, but despite differences between conservative and liberal Muslims, most American Muslims do have religious traits in common. They rely upon what are heartfelt understandings of their sacred texts and religious traditions in coming to understand their moral and ethical obligations as people of faith. So there are a whole host of issues. There are all sorts of people, ideas, and places where American Muslims come from. There's no one form of Muslim spirituality or religious practice in America, and we'll explore just a couple of the parts of Islam in America as we go through today. And I want to start in colonial America. From colonial times to the present day, many Americans have been alternately allured and repulsed by images of the Muslim Orient, which is often associated, unfairly, with political despotism, sexual excess, and cultural backwardness. This understanding of Islam, Muslims, and the Orient is called Orientalism by scholars, and often said much more about non-Muslim American fears, interests, and traditions than it did about actual Muslims. But in the early 1800s, a significant number of white American men journeyed to the Christian Holy Land in Palestine, recording their impressions of Middle Eastern Muslims and Muslim holy sites in popular travelogues. For some American men, the chance to travel to the Middle East was an opportunity to affirm their male identities. Their writings contain wild fantasies about Muslim harems, and they even dressed up like Turkish sultans, imagining themselves as potent men who dominated exotic Oriental women. That's not really the case of what it was. In the 1870s, even, Muslim signs and symbols were incorporated into the ritual acts of a fraternal organization, the ancient Arabic order of the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine. In other words, the Shriners. Okay? Now, that's really just a strange, personally, I think, a strange group that does a lot of social service, but is really just taking over other ideas. Though 19th century America may have been saturated with images of Islam and the Muslim Orient, it's striking that actual human contact between Muslims and non-Muslims outside the United States was rare, and in the U.S. as well. An important exception was the interaction of Muslim slaves with non-Muslim slaves, slaveholders, and eager ethnographers in the antebellum U.S. Most of the Muslims who first came to the Americas in the colonial period were West African slaves. While it's difficult to estimate the number of slaves who were Muslim, many scholars believe that as many as 10 to 20% of all slaves imported into the United States were Muslim. It makes sense that at least some slaves were Muslim, since Islam was a vital component of many West African cultures. Some of these were urbane and literate merchants or mystics. Some had memorized their Arabic Quran by heart. In the Americas, these persons maintained their Arabic literacy by reading Arabic New Testaments given to them by Christian missionaries and by purchasing expensive supplies of paper to practice their writing. Just how many black Muslims continue to practice Islam in British North America and the United States is difficult to know. In general, historians have uncovered more evidence of Islamic practices in places where slaves lived in predominantly isolated areas, or where there were more first and second generation African Americans. One of the greatest records of an early African American Muslim history in the United States was the 1831 autobiography of Omar ibn Said, a North Carolinian slave originally from Futu Toro in the Senegal River. Like other educated West Africans, he was literate in written Arabic, the language of the Quran, and the lingua franca in West Africa. In his memoir, Said claimed to have been a baptized Christian for some years, but he dedicated his work not only to God, but also to the Prophet Muhammad. Whether he was hiding his true Muslim identity or combining his Islam with his Christianity is really unknown, but it does indicate a continued influence of Islam on his consciousness well after his conversion to Christianity. Another well-known Muslim was Yarrow Mahmoud, whose portrait you see there painted by Charles Wilson Peale. He also was brought to the Americas and was a mason and bricklayer in Baltimore. We get much of the evidence for Islamic slaves from graves, where there are certain amulets and other hints of Islam. We get it from names: Omar ibn Said, Yarrow Mahmoud, Fatima, other names, from whether they are from ship manifests, auctions, or other things. We do see evidence of Islamic heritage. We also see it from rations. Sometimes, it would be rare, but sometimes it does happen that slave masters would respect the dietary wishes of their slaves and let them eat halal. In other words, they would trade out their pork rations for beef or other rations. So we do see some evidence of that. Now we're going to skip around a lot today, and I do want to move then from this period from World War I to 1965. After World War I began, emigration from the Ottoman Empire, much of what we could now call Turkey, as well as other places, slowed. While immigrants resumed after the war ended, the number of Muslim immigrants was severely curtailed by the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act. This law virtually banned immigration from Asia, Southern and Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, including a quota system that strongly favored white immigrants. Those first-generation Muslim immigrants continued to arrive in American shores. This period of American Muslim history was shaped much, if not more, by second and third generation Muslim Americans who ensured the continuity of American Muslim institutions and communities. Many Muslim immigrants had become citizens of the United States and were determined to become fully American, while still preserving their religious and ethnic identities. During this period, there's evidence that Muslims from Albania and Turkish Mevlevis, the so-called whirling dervishes, settled in Detroit, among other American cities. After Albanian independence in 1912 and the subsequent invasion by Greece, the number of Albanian immigrants to the U.S. increased, and by 1945, they had established the Albanian American Muslim Association in Detroit. By the early 50s, members of the Detroit community, with help from Albanians around the country, formed a mosque and a Sufi lodge where a spiritual and religious master, the Baba, conducted Muslim prayers, initiation ceremonies, and dhikr, and I know I'm butchering that, or the remembrance and praise of God and the Prophet. While hoping to preserve certain aspects of their ethnic Albanian traditions, most of these immigrants proudly proclaimed their American identity and saw the United States as a haven for the practice of Islam. Now, Albanians constituted only one of several Muslim groups, both indigenous and immigrant, that made the Motor City a center of Muslim American activity. For example, Lebanese immigrant Mohammed Karoub helped to construct a mosque in the Detroit area, his brother Hussein reportedly serving as imam. Both Sunni and Shia Muslims from Lebanon and Syria moved in large numbers to Detroit and nearby Dearborn. In 1920, hundreds of Turkish Muslims from the Balkans and Anatolia also established a Detroit chapter of the Red Crescent, what's the equivalent of the Red Cross, and purchased grave plots so they could bury the community's departed in accordance with Islamic law. The Ahmadiyya, a South Asian Islamic group, also put down roots in this period. After World War I, missionaries from this group appeared in the U.S. ready to spread Islam. The Ahmadiyya had been established in the late 1800s in the Indian Punjab, where some followers of a man named Ghulam Ahmad proclaimed himself to be a prophet, a messianic figure meant to lead the Muslim community towards peace and justice. Though many other Muslims thought that the followers of Ahmad were heretics, they pressed ahead with their missionary efforts, becoming one of the most successful missionary groups to non-Muslims in modern times. Known for distributing English translations of the Quran, the Ahmadiyya established a center in Chicago and traveled around the country, where head missionary Muhammad Sadiq praised Islam as a religion of peace and reason. He also targeted African Americans for conversions, promising that Islam offered them equality and freedom. Now, some African Americans who joined the Ahmadiyya were migrants from the American South. During the years between World War I and World War II, over 1.5 million African Americans moved from rural areas in the South to cities in the North. Those who came as part of this great migration lived near and sometimes worked with Muslim immigrants from the Middle East. As the conversion of African American Muslims to Ahmadiyya shows, these black American migrants were part of a dynamic cultural environment where the ideas and culture of Asian immigrants were beginning to influence African American religious culture and vice versa. And African American Muslims were not simply joining Asian immigrant groups, they were creating their own forms of Islam. The first to do so was Timothy Drew, a native of North Carolina who traveled to New Jersey as part of this great migration. While living in Chicago in the 1920s, Drew attracted hundreds, if not thousands, of black Americans to his Moorish Science Temple, the first indigenous African American group to claim that blacks were both biologically and historically Muslim. Creating a complicated historical genealogy based on scriptures in the Hebrew Bible, Drew argued that black people were racially linked to Asiatic peoples, whose natural religion was Islam. He took the title of Noble Drew Ali and became known as a prophet. His Holy Quran of the Moorish Science Temple, a document entirely different from the Quran revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, preached the importance of moral behavior, industrial work habits, and social solidarity. It also promised that the secrets of Moorish science would bring earthly and divine salvation to persons of African descent. Many of the Islamic symbols that Drew adapted, including his fez and title of noble, came not from Islamic culture, but from the black Shriners. The Moorish Science Temple was more a child of a black fraternal organization in American popular culture than it was of Afro-Eurasian Islamic traditions. Now, many scholars of African American Islam have focused their research on the Nation of Islam, but much less is known about the thousands of African Americans who who converted and practiced other forms of Islam, including Sunni Islam in the early 1930s. Groups like the First Cleveland Mosque, guided by the African American convert named Wali Akram, often focused their attention on the 5 pillars of Islam. Other examples of early black Muslim communities included the Universal Arabic Association in Buffalo and Jabul Arabiya, a Muslim communal farm located in New York. As more and more African Americans came to identify themselves as Muslims, the number of Muslims in the United States also rose due to a wave of visitors, students, and immigrants in the Islamic world. And I'm sorry here, I see I went too far in the thing. After World War II, many of the former European colonies in Asia and Africa declared their independence from European powers. In the wake of these political revolutions, those Muslims who were perceived to be too close to former occupiers, or who were viewed, for one reason or another, as opponents of the new regimes, were often persecuted and dispossessed. Many Palestinian Arabs lost their homes and livelihoods, and some lost refuge in the United States after 1948. After the 1952 revolution in Egypt, those who lost favor with the regime of Gamal Nasser also fled. These immigrants joined other American Muslims who were, by this time, starting to organize on a national scale. So by the 1950s, students from the newly independent states in Africa and Asia also started to attend American universities. In many instances, they criticized what they saw as the assimilation of immigrant Muslims into American culture. Many of those students were also influenced by the rise of Islam as a vehicle of social and political protest against often oppressive socialist and nationalist regimes in the, quote, old country. These newly arrived students even clashed with older Muslim Americans who adopted some of the characteristics of non-Muslim American religionists. And I want to skip then back to that page that I went to a little bit too early, sorry. During the 1960s, African-American Muslim leader Malcolm X renounced the teachings of Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad, rejecting the claim that all white people were blue-eyed devils. He set out in 1964 on his famous Hajj, or pilgrimage, to Mecca, and shared the news with folks back home that he felt spiritual kinship with some Muslims who happened to be white. Later that same year, he was invited back to Mecca to be trained as a Muslim missionary by the Muslim World League, a missionary organization supported by Saudi Arabia that promoted Islamic education and outreach to both the Islamic world and the West. Malcolm's continuing commitment to black liberation even after his pilgrimage, an aspect of his story that sometimes is forgotten, put him at odds with many of his fellow Muslim missionaries. His debates with them symbolize a long-standing tension in the American Muslim community between many, but not all, immigrants and African Americans. Even after discarding Elijah Muhammad's racial view of Islam, Malcolm X refused to abandon the fight for black liberation, saying he felt his first duty was to help persons of African descent achieve full equality. Until his assassination in 1965, he proudly proclaimed his religious identity as an Orthodox Muslim and a black revolutionary. Like some fellow Muslim activists across the world, at least a few African American Muslims separated themselves from mainstream society and formed vanguards that followed the precepts of Sharia, or Islamic law and ethics. For example, a predominantly African American group of believers broke away from Sheikh Duwad's Islamic Mission of America to form the Yansin Mosque. They insisted on a more literal adherence to Sharia. Other African Americans, however, focused more on community activism and involvement, building a multi-ethnic Islam. In the late 1960s, Sheikh Tawfiq, an African American from Florida, founded the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood in Harlem, stressing the call of Islamic universalism, the idea that Islam crossed all racial barriers. African Americans, Hispanic, and others prayed together, established housing and education programs, and ran small businesses in the heart of U.S.'s largest city. Such groups blurred the important social distinctions between immigrant and indigenous by emphasizing common religious roots. Despite, or perhaps because of the diversity of American Muslims and persons in this era, one can conclude that by this time, and again we're talking between 1918 and 1965, Islam was no passing fad. From World War I to 1965, Americans established Islam, however one defined it, as an institutional presence and a vital aspect of American culture and society. Now we're going to skip over to 1965 and beyond. In 1965, as I've mentioned in other lectures, Lyndon Johnson signed an immigration bill that reversed the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, severely restricting non-white immigration. As a result, thousands of people from Latin America, Asia, and Africa began to arrive in the U.S. Between 1965 and 1990, more than 800,000 people would come from South Asia alone. Many of the South Asian Muslim immigrants were successful doctors, engineers, and academics. They changed the face of American Islam, becoming one of the most financially successful immigrant groups in the history of the U.S. Many of these South Asian Muslims, along with immigrants from the Middle East, established their own mosques and schools far away from the inner-city mosques frequented by African-American Muslims. There are many exceptions, but one might argue that after 1965, American Muslims, like American Christians, remained divided by class and race, living in segregated neighborhoods, attending segregated schools, and only marrying people of the same race and class. Now, the varieties of Islamic religion practiced in the United States from 65 to today reflects the remarkable racial and ethnic diversity of the American Muslim community. While at least some Shia Muslims arrived in America decades before 1965, the period after 65 saw a dramatic increase in the number of Shia Muslims, many of whom were professionals and students from Iran and Lebanon. Other Shia Muslims arrived as refugees. During the long Lebanese Civil War, which lasted from 1975 to 1990, and later during the Gulf War of 1990 to 91 and the Iraq War of 2003, continuing very long, many Shia Muslims sought to escape the violence and turmoil of their home countries. They are a diverse group. The Iranian Shia are generally Persian speakers. Some of them were completely secular Muslims. The Lebanese and Iraqi Shia were generally Arabic speakers, though their ethnic and linguistic identities also set them apart from one another. Moreover, the Shia Muslim community was divided by political ideology. After the Iranian Revolution of 75, in which Ayatollah Khomeini seized power, many Shia expressed solidarity with his goals, but others wanted nothing to do with Khomeini, and what they feared would be a backlash against them because of the conflict between Iran and the U.S. During this time, as refugees continued to arrive in various cities, especially around Detroit, mosques sometimes split, and new ones were created to accommodate the increased number of believers and their differing ideologies. Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, also grew and became more diverse during this period. Though Sufis had been part of the American Muslim scene since Turks, Albanians, and Punjabis immigrated to the U.S., a larger number came after 65. Sufi orders, called tariqas, and I know I'm butchering that, became more numerous and popular. For example, Sri Lankan Sufi master Bawa Muhyiddin, who had trained as a Sufi tariqa, arrived and established a community of followers in Philly. A number of white Americans began to turn to Sufism as a religious path. Some of those who claimed to be Sufis did not label themselves as Muslims, but others sought to follow Sufi ideas in tandem with foundational Islamic practices like the daily prayers and fasting during Ramadan. Buya Mahadin, for example, slowly led his followers in Philadelphia toward the 5 pillars of Islamic practice. According to one follower, he first emphasized the spiritual nature of Islamic religion and the teachings of Sufism. Then he discussed the need to observe basic rituals of prayer and fasting. By the turn of the millennium, American Sufism was a cross-class and multi-ethnic phenomenon. Some Sufi masters creating their own organizations. Others arrived as representatives of oldie Sufi orders. All these groups catered to a variety of tastes in the U.S., and their memberships sometimes reified and other times challenged the racial and class divisions of American Muslim communities. Many of Mujahideen's followers celebrated the interracial nature of their community, but a West African Sufi order central to Senegalese society appealed mainly to African American Muslims, whom one might find in a Sufi lodge in Brooklyn, engaged in types of dhikr, rituals of meditation and praise for God and the Prophet, practiced by their African brothers and sisters across the Atlantic. The Sunni Muslim community became more diverse than ever as well. During the 70s, an increasing number of imams and preachers, trained and funded by the same missionaries who sponsored Malcolm X's second visit to Saudi Arabia, began to serve as leaders of various Muslim communities in the U.S. These financial supporters were successful missionaries for socially conservative form of Islam that bore a great deal of resemblance to one might call family values Christianity and Judaism. Many of these missionaries and their followers were devoted to a Salafi interpretation of Islam. According to most scholars of religion, the Salafi movement, though at first glance is traditional, is actually a thoroughly modern and reformist version of Islam. While Salafi Muslims are a diverse group, they tend to believe that the practice of Islam has become corrupted since the time of the Prophet and the pious ancestors, the Salaf. They wish to return to what they see as the original and uncorrupted teachings of Islam, and therefore dismiss or question the legitimacy of many Islamic traditions. Some Salafis see Sufism as an impermissible addition to the corpus of Islamic thought, and often accuse Sufis of heresy. Furthermore, Salafis often reject on principle the notion that there can be several different interpretations of Sharia. For them, there is only one straight path, clearly laid out in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. Some Salafi Muslims are exclusivists, meaning that they think they have a monopoly on religious truth, but it's important to note that the vast majority of them are peaceful exclusivists. The American Muslims who were influenced by the missionaries and other Muslims devoted to a Salafi interpretation of Islam are a diverse lot. Salafi Islam was not only attractive to immigrants but also to indigenous Muslims. Some Salafi Muslims stressed the importance of personal piety, while others advocated a political form of Islam that, following the philosophy of activist Sayyid Qutb, called for the establishment of an Islamic political authority, or caliph, over all the earth. Salafi Muslims may have shared certain ideas, but they also differ on others. One African-American leader of the Sunni Islamic movement, called Darul Islam, declared in the 70s that Muslims should avoid participation in American politics if those politicians did not practice the correct form of Islam. But his group never stressed the same degree of opposition to Sufism or traditional interpretations of Islamic law that some Salafis did. So again, there are huge varieties of Islam practice in the U.S. And of course, we need to turn then to the questions of women, gender, and the veil. Of all the questions debated in American Islam, none is more hotly contested than the issue of gender and Islam, a subject of great interest to non-Muslim Americans as well. In fact, the intra-Muslim debate about gender is shaped partially by the assumption among many non-Muslim Americans that quote-unquote traditional Islam oppresses women. The ultimate symbol of that oppression for many is the practice of veiling, which is taken by some to be inherently discriminatory. On American TV and in the movies, one normally does not get to hear the voice of a veiled woman. Instead, one is treated to a silent image of the covered woman and is often expected to see in this image evidence of oppression. But many feminists, both Muslim and non, call this practice double objectification. In other words, not only do women in Islamic societies, like the vast majority of societies, face gender prejudice, but they're silenced in their representation in society here in the U.S. Thus, most Americans have never actually met a woman who wears a veil, or heard them speak about why they wear such a garment. In many American Muslim circles, very few Muslim women say that Islam is inherently oppressive. To the contrary, most American Muslim women see Islam as a liberating force, but they disagree over what it means to be a liberated Muslim woman. For example, the popular South Asian American writer Asma Gul Hassan admits there is much sexism in the Muslim world, but blames what she identified as patriarchal culture rather than Islam for this phenomenon. Now, as you can see, there are lots of different styles of the hijab, the veil. There's also burqa. There's a number of other different styles, different interpretations, different reasons why people wear them. And I do realize that one of those images is in French. I'm sorry, it was the best image I could find to show those different styles. Now, Asma Hassan, the woman I just mentioned a second ago, does not normally wear a hijab or headscarf. She argues that it is modesty of the heart that matters most. In fact, she says, the promotion of the hijab is part of a conservative Muslim political agenda. According to her reading of the Quran, both men and women need only to cover themselves in modest clothing when making their prayers. But many American Muslim women disagree. Some see the hijab not as a conservative symbol, but as a sign of their personal and political liberation. While some American Muslim women wear the hijab only at mosque, others wear it at both work and school. Some see the headscarf as a way of letting others know they're Muslim. They feel like it's a quiet form of missionary work. For others, the headscarf may be a fashion accessory, a form of adornment that reflects actually a sense of beauty. In addition to donning a headscarf, a few American Muslim women wear the face covering, or the face veil, covering all but their eyes. In the U.S., those who wear such dress emphasize it is their choice. Their personal freedom comes by fully submitting to the will of God as they understand it. While discussions of the veil threaten to monopolize public discourse on gender and Islam, American women themselves are concerned about a much broader array of issues, not just the veil. So let's go beyond the veil for a little bit. In this way, American Muslim women are like other American women. They insist on the right to read and interpret the meaning of sacred scripture for themselves. For example, Quranic scholar Amina Wadud, an African-American convert, sees the Quran as a liberating document. Like Asma Hassan, she argues that many Muslim communities are patriarchal. Reports that many Muslims have rejected her scholarship as un-Islamic, westernized, feminist. Wadud argues that the Quran depicts men and women as equal, different, and complementary, stresses that the Quran does not prescribe set gender roles for either. There's no gender hierarchy in the Quran, she argues, and women need not always be mothers and wives. Wadud's style of textual interpretation is popular outside the walls of the academy. In formal and informal study groups around the country, American Muslim women read and reread the sacred texts of Islam as a way to understand and renew their relationships to other women, male Muslim leaders, husbands, mosques, non-Muslim workplaces, and their neighborhoods. As in Muslim-majority countries around the world, feminist interpretations of the Quran are not only rendered by Muslim elites, but also Muslims at the grassroots. As important as the issue of interpretation is, like many American Muslims, Muslim women live under the authority of a government that, in practice, singles out Muslims for government surveillance while promising to protect their human rights. Every day, Muslim women, like Muslim men, face suspicion from the general public. Just having a Muslim name or wearing a hijab immediately puts them at risk. They might be denied a seat on an airplane. They may face unemployment discrimination. And they may be subject to stares, fear, even hostility. Muslim women of color, like men of color, may experience further discrimination because of their race. As women, they know gender discrimination, the kind that comes from within the Muslim community, as well as that without. The U.S. is full of sexism. At the same time, Muslim women often laud the ideals, if not always the practice, of the U.S. There's a kind of religious freedom in the U.S. difficult to find elsewhere. The U.S. is a wealthy country that offers some degree of economic opportunity to many, and by living in such an ethnically and religiously diverse nation, they say, they have a chance to forge an Islam that is pluralistic, interracial, and socially just. So, again, moving way back to our lecture question, what is Islam in America like? Well, like lots of other groups we've looked at, it's incredibly diverse. There are all sorts of different groups represented. There are all sorts of tensions within it. Just simply the question of how much Americanization to face is a huge issue. And yet, Islam has been in the United States since the colonial days. It's not just a religion that appeared sometime briefly before 2001. It's been here since slaves have been here. And so, Islam in America, like other religions in America, is diverse, is fascinating, includes all sorts of different people, groups, cultures, ethnicities, languages, nations of origins. All right. Well, I should probably stop. Should probably wrap this up. I do want to thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening to these lectures. This is the last one, like I said. So thank you very much for listening through, and remember to get working on your report.